So you've written an extensive body of work surrounding the history of comedy, which we'll get onto in a moment. But first, I just wanted to think more generally about comedy. In your opinion, how significant is your role as an entertainment writer and historian in preserving Britain's cultural heritage?
See, I see myself as the recording angel, the one who sits with the little pad and the pen, and I get things down. I get other people's stories down, try to make sense of them. And, when people buy my books, they're not buying my books. They might buy my book because I'd written a good one. They think, oh, well, this guy knows what he's on about. But I'm not the main attraction. The main attraction is the people on the front cover, the Morecambe and Wises, the Ken Dodds, the Les Dawsons. And the other main attraction is the people who worked with them, the people who knew them. And, for me, it's basically about getting their stories right. A couple of times, Angela, when we did the Morecambe and Wise thing, Angela Rippon said, oh, you've got that slightly wrong, but that's how someone else remembered it. So people remember things in different ways. So she was very, very, very good and gracious about it. But, as a journalist, she knows all about how to deal with sources and things like that. I wish I could have spoken to her beforehand, but it wasn't possible.
Louis Barfe, he had teaching. He was a great
Josh had a similar moment with Barry Cryer a little while ago when Josh brought up a question about him being at a Greek restaurant with Ronnie Barker, and Barry Cryer wasn't even aware. He was like, "Was I at the restaurant?"
And I can tell you that I did once have dinner with Ronnie Barker, and I can tell you exactly where it was. It was a restaurant called Mezzo in Soho, and it was a launch for the book of scripts that he'd brought out. But he's not here to verify that now. But it definitely happened. But also, the thing is that's another thing. I think I'm incredibly lucky because I'm 48 now, and I started doing this sort of stuff about 20 years ago, and there are a lot of people who were around then who aren't now. And I met Ronnie Barker, I met Ronnie Corbett, I knew Barry Cryer very well, and I knew a lot of the producers who worked with these people: Stuart Morris, Ernest Maxim, John Ammons. And so if I was starting now, I wouldn't be able to go to these people. And when I got the job, when I got the call to do the Morecambe and Wise book from my publisher, I thought, what can I bring to it? And I thought, hang on, I knew John and Ernest. And I interviewed them probably more than anyone. So I went back to my interview tapes and found that I had stuff that no one else had really used or mentioned. Because Morecambe and Wise, how many times can you tell the same story? There are a lot of books out there. I mean, it's a great story, and I thought, am I going to be retreading things? And then I realized, actually, no. There are things that I care about that other writers have glanced over, rather. Like, for example, Janet Webb. I was fascinated with the whole thing of Janet Webb, and I wanted to know more about her. And in other books, other great books, she gets a paragraph. I thought, no, let's find out as much as we can about Janet Webb. I hate writing. I love research. I love finding stuff out, and I love bolting it all together. But I'm basically a flat pack writer.
The rise of the comedy historian is somewhat of a new phenomenon, yet the role of the comedy historian has itself become woven into Britain's popular culture. With this in mind, how have leading historians like yourself, Graham McCann, Stuart Jeffries, Robert Ross, and Dick Fiddy helped to expand our understanding of the significance of recording the changing face of entertainment?
Well, it's a great honour to be bracketed along those people, and several of them are very good friends. I know Dick and Robert incredibly well, and I know Graham slightly and respect him hugely. The others, I know their work, but I haven't met. And I think what we do is view everything in terms of the social history of the time and try and contextualize it. I think that comedy doesn't happen in a vacuum. Comedy is in so many ways a response to the time in which it is. I mean, some of it is timeless, but so much of it is of its time, and not in that way that we talk about excusing, racism and whatever. Oh, that was a different time. There are things that were funny in 1950 that would be baffling now. With the context that I have and hopefully supply, I can make the baffling stuff interesting. It's like doing Shakespeare at school. Do you remember when you did Shakespeare at school and the teacher would say, "Oh no, this bit was incredibly funny in 1600." And it was doing nothing now. It's going a long way for a laugh now. And I think that, yeah, I think we contextualize things. I think we supply the background.
And I think it's about creating image of what it was like.
Yeah, it's all about creating an image of what it was like.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, you've gone quiet.
Right, okay. There we go. We're back. Sorry. That's it. There we go. Right.
Good.
That's better.
Yeah. I now feel like I'm at a press conference.
One of the striking things about you is that you graduated from Lancaster University with a degree in politics. Is there any correlation between politics and comedy?
No. Well, there is, obviously, there's satire and everything like that. But for me, the politics degree, what it did was it gave me a grounding in dealing with information. So it was more the framework of what the degree gave me than the subject, and I've applied that sort of academic side of it to the research for the books and everything. So, but also obviously I am a political animal. Anyone who's followed me on Twitter will know precisely where my loyalties lie, and it's but at the same time, I think people who follow me on Twitter and see, various broadsides, and then they buy the books and they go, "Oh, he's not ranting here." There's two, there's a time and a place for everything, and the books are sacrosanct. Again, it comes back to the thing of, I'm not the main attraction. I'm just the recording angel.
Your 2008 book, Turned Out Nice Again, told the story of light entertainment through the eyes of the people who were instrumental to its success. How significant was Moss Empires to the preservation of variety, which then influenced television entertainment?
Well, Moss Empires, I think, took variety from the music halls into what we call variety, because music halls they started out as originally. Most music halls started out as pubs, and then the landlord, he put a bit of entertainment on, and then the entertainment would take over, and he'd build a hall on the back of the pub, and that would be the first theatre, the first music hall. And of course, the music halls weren't licensed like theatres. They were actually licensed under a different law, which covered brothels. And then Moss Empires professionalized, and they turned it into a hybrid of theatre and music hall, made that variety. And also they had Frank Matcham building these wonderful empires, these wonderful theatres, these wonderful buildings, which many of which, not enough of them survive. And but the ones that do survive, if you talk to a comedian who's active today, like Al Murray in particular, Al and I have had many conversations about how much Frank Matcham got right. He said, when you play a Frank Matcham theatre, you just know that this was designed by someone who understood performing and how to get across to an audience. He said, however big they are, and the Palladium is huge, they feel incredibly intimate. You feel like you're just getting straight across, and that is a tribute to the design. And the way Moss Empires was run, it was the case that, getting, because you'd work your way up. You'd do the number 3s, the number 2s, and the Moss Empires and the Stoll circuit were the number 1s, and you'd work your way up through the halls to get onto the number 1 circuit. And I don't think Moss Empires preserved variety. I think it was a very unromantic, unsentimental view of everything. And when television came in and variety started to dwindle, Moss Empires had no compunction in selling off the sites and putting office blocks up instead. So they didn't preserve much. And also it's very hard to preserve variety. You can film it, you can make records of it, but you can't capture the atmosphere. You can't capture it's trapping lightning in a bottle, really. And there are so many acts from the variety age who you had to be there. You just had to be there. And the stuff that survives gives just a tiny flavor of how amazing they were. Yeah. But it won't give it completely. But of course, Moss Empires were, and Stoll, they were all linked up very closely with the grades. And when television came in, the whole ethos of variety and the whole thing that had been the Moss Empires was carried through into ATV. So it's Val Parnell, Lou Grade and all that. So the same attitude and the same, Lou Grade built a TV schedule like he was building a variety bill. So I think that preserved variety. I think he's the linchpin.
And Peter Pritchard was related to Frank Matcham.
Frank Matcham. Sorry, I was having microphone trouble again, trying to sort it. Sorry, could you repeat the question? Sorry, I was.
No. Josh was just saying Peter Pritchard was related to Frank as well.
Ah, was he? Well, Pete Pritchard was connected to all sorts of things in variety. His grandmother ran a boarding house for turns, and apparently when Peter was a kid, his grand's basement was full of props from the first 20 years of the 20th century. While Bill Hickok and all that coming over from America and doing gunfights on the stage. So Peter was steeped in it. Yeah.
And he lives
and he lived at the site where TV Centre was built.
Ah, Shepherd's Bush, yes, yeah.
This is getting nerdy, isn't it?
But it's a risk. You get two massive nerds together, and it's going to go.
It's like a battle off, isn't it? Yeah.
No.
It's your turn now. Go on. Yeah, it's your turn.
No. We encourage each other to greater heights of nerddom. That's
Oh, of course, yeah.
People I remember then they go me he said I just put my car in my feet.
Your pocket work.
My bed.
Putting your car in your bedroom. Yeah. And Colin Edmonds told Josh that when he used to have to go to meetings at TV Centre, he'd just say, "I'll just pop my car in my bedroom."
Yeah.
So, in hindsight, you were somewhat lucky at that time of writing. Many of the protagonists and campaigners within the story were still alive. What effects did this have on the authenticity of the book? And what was the process for obtaining these interviews?
Well, the authenticity of the book comes from getting all the different stories and harmonizing them, because, as I've said before, people remember things differently, and and also, people don't set out to mislead, but they can remember their own. We all remember our own stories differently, and people will say, "No, hang on, that was so and so," and you go, "Oh, blimey, it was right." Like when I was a kid, there are things that I remember happening at a certain time, and I go back and check the TV schedules, and they couldn't have been at that time. It's impossible, and that's me myself remembering it. The process of getting the interviews is basically very simple. I imagine it's exactly how you do it, Josh. You just get in touch and say, "Hello, I'm doing this. Can we speak?" And I think what I found, and what you will doubtless have found, is it gets easier the better known you are and the more trusted you are. I think people, once people do a thing, they'll say, "Oh, he's all right. Yeah, you talk to him, you'll be fine." And because I think justifiably, in a lot of cases, I think people are very suspicious of anyone sniffing around trying to find, why does he want to know this? Why is he asking me this? Who cares about this? And also, you get people and they say, "Well, I'll help you, but I don't know how much I can remember." And then at the end of it, they go, "I didn't know I could remember that much." And they're incredibly helpful. It's but yeah, it's just a case of, "Hello, I'm doing this thing. Could you help me, please?" And 99 times out of 100, they'll say, "Yeah."
The celebrated Les Dawson became the subject of your 2012 book, The Trials and Triumphs of Les Dawson. In terms of his route into comedy, he was rather unique in that he didn't come up through what was then the conventional avenues of variety, and obviously an inspired spot and on Opportunity Knocks presented the perfect platform. How do you think this helped to influence the rest of his career?
I don't know the way he came. I think the way he came up, and the fact that it took an incredibly long time for him to become famous, was what influenced his career. I think what went up, what goes up slowly stays up, and I think that he struggled and nearly gave up several times. I think that was what molded his career as well. Just that whole attitude of the underdog, because he was always everything was always wrong, and I think, but I think that spoke to the audience. I think people, most people have lives where not everything goes right, and I think the night in Hull in 90, he started out as a very conventional entertainer, all teeth and smiles, and this is really lovely, great thing, well, ladies and gentlemen. And then one night in Hull, he got absolutely out of his tree, went on stage and just went, "I don't want to be here. I don't want to be here in this kipper depot." And he started insulting the audience, and he started insulting Hull, and they loved it. And he did it the following night to make sure it wasn't a fluke, and it wasn't. And he became the guy who knocked stuff, but affectionately. I think a lot of British comedy is affectionate knocking. And we're allowed to take the mick out of ourselves, but no one else. And also with Eric and Ernie, they took the mick out of each other, but they wouldn't let anyone else do it to the other one.
Mm.
It's a no. And with biographies, you feel like you've got the person living with you, or at least I do. And I've got to say that the year I spent living with Les Dawson was really, really happy. I loved having him around. I just felt good having him there. And Eric and Ernie, I loved them too. But I'll be honest, I came out of that one thinking Ernie didn't get the credit he was due, and I came out of that with increased respect for both of them. But I came out of that really loving Ernie. And Doddy was great, and Doddy's the only one I've written about who I actually met. And Doddy's fascinating because he didn't want anyone to write about him, but he loved reading about comedians.
Yeah.
He loved biographies of comedians, but he didn't want anybody writing a book about him. There was nothing to hide, nothing sinister. He just wasn't interested in it. And I just thought, when I got the call to do the book, I'll be honest, the last two books have come. The idea has come from the publisher, and they said, we want a book on so-and-so. I haven't gone to them saying, I must do a book on so-and-so. And with Doddy, I thought, is it too soon? I mean, I'd like to, but is it too soon? Because it was a couple of months after he died. And then I thought, well, if I don't, they'll get someone else to do it, and they might not do it well. So I might as well do it. And also I need the money. So and then where was I? Doddy. Yeah, he didn't want people writing about him, and I was very aware of that, thinking, how am I going to approach this and do it in a way that he would have wanted to read if it had been someone else? So I had that in the back of my mind, and I with Doddy, I mean, apart from the comedy, there was very, very little there. He lived to work. He lived to be Ken Dodd, and he lived for those moments on stage, and everything else was just between performances.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Josh.
His personal life. Yeah. He didn't like talking about his personal life either, so there wasn't really anything that you could have interviewed or talked to him about, really, because he didn't like talking about it in the first place. No, and Stephen Griffin, who wrote a good book about him during his lifetime, found that it was incredibly hard because people were happy to talk, but not on the record, because they didn't want to upset Doddy. Which is fair enough, and it's why I've never written a book about a living comedian, because you can't hit a moving target, basically.
Yeah.
Like most comedians, there's so many layers to Les Dawson, from his signature piano playing to Sissy and Ada. Yet an unlikely partnership occurred on the ITV sketch show Says Les, where he starred alongside John Cleese. In your opinion, how significant was this union in bringing the comedy fraternity together?
Well, it's an interesting one, because Cleese was doing, it was around the time that he was working on Fawlty Towers, and he wanted to take a step back from Python. And the common denominator in all this is Barry Cryer and also David Nobbs, who had written for David Frost. Cleese had worked with David Frost. And so they all knew each other. And I think they got Cleese in for a couple of quickies in Says Les. And Les being Les and Cleese being Cleese, during the tea breaks, they'd sit and talk, and suddenly they realised that actually these two blokes really liked each other and got on, and they were, you know, John Cleese, university educated, Les Dawson, very, very instinctive education, very instinctive intelligence. And Cleese, very analytical, loved the way Les's brain worked. And Les loved the way Cleese broke everything down and analysed it. And they formed quite a partnership. And then when Cleese was taking a step back from Monty Python, they said, "Do you want to come and do more Says Les's?" And he went, "Oh yeah, great, yeah," because it was, you know, it was work, but it wasn't the massive workload of doing Python, and it was time spent with someone he really enjoyed spending time with. And again, back to Barry Cryer, in the 80s, when they used to have the BBC television light entertainment Christmas parties, they used to be the alternatives up one end and the old guard up the other end, and Barry was the one in the middle, and he got the two ends of the room together and got them into one party. So you'd have, you know, Adrian Edmondson and Paul Daniels at the same party, and suddenly, because Barry knew and liked everyone, he'd get them all mixing. And but I think, you know, the thing of old guards and new guards is that you know, the enfant terrible become the old guard eventually, because now we're in a situation where who's the old guard? Dawn French, Jennifer Saunders, Ade Edmondson. You know, they've all been going for 40 years. And now they're the comedy royalty. They're, you know, Lenny Henry, Sir Lenny Henry. The fact that he's got a knighthood, you know, these were the, you know, the alternatives. The alternative becomes the mainstream.
I hope about that. I do that. So can like you heard certain like been her
Yeah, Josh has a theory about that. That first generation that we were just speaking about, do you think they'll always occupy a place in the comedy landscape just because they were the first ones to do everything? So more versatile performers?
Which generation are we talking about?
the
The postmodern generation.
Okay, yeah. Well, in terms of writing their own stuff.
Oh, sorry, Louis. Post-war generation.
Yeah. Well, no, I think the reason they're the first generation really to produce anything that was designed to be seen again and again. In the music hall days, you could tour for 50 years with the same act.
Yeah.
Television came in and you had to do fresh stuff every time. But because of recording, that stuff would get repeated and would become well known. And by, you know, the third or fourth time, it's not like you're laughing at a new joke. It's like you're greeting an old friend, you know, like Andre Previn.
Yeah.
That's, you know, I still laugh just as much, but you know, I know exactly. I mean, there's a point to it that you start laughing ahead of the joke because you know what's coming and you anticipate it. So I think they were the first generation to have anything like posterity. Out of austerity came posterity. There's your slogan. But out of rationing came passion. No, anyway, and so, and I think now, but my phone's going off.
You get that?
How did you get
Anyway.
that? So Josh wants it.
Oh, I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you. I copied it off. I actually copied it off an LP that I've got, and I will send you the MP3. I promise. And I actually got the LP signed by Parky at the Morecambe and Wise thing. So yeah. So I think also now we have a cycle of nostalgia that we didn't have before, and so 20 years after something happens, it becomes good to remember it. The first 10 years after it's happening, it's just something that happened within the last 10 years. And then in that second 10 years, it mellows and matures. And then, so when I was a student in the 90s, flared trousers came back. Horrible, horrible things. Now you've got sort of, oh yeah, Grandad, remember year 2000? Oh, Christ, is the year 2000 vintage? I thought it was last week. And so, but the cycle of nostalgia is such that, so Eric and Ernie didn't, there was a period after Eric died in 84 where Morecambe and Wise were hugely fondly remembered, but they weren't on telly all the time every Christmas. Between 84 and I think about 93, I don't think there were that many repeats of their shows. And then in that 10 years, 93 to 2003, it became like Morecambe and Wise are back at Christmas, because they put one, I think they put one on a Christmas day because they had a slot to fill. And I thought, oh, well, what will go in there? Late at night, like 11 o'clock or whatever. And what will go in there that everyone likes? Oh, Morecambe and Wise, shove that in. And it went mad. So they started doing it every year. And then it becomes this engine of nostalgia. So, and there is all of this stuff that can be repeated. And we're starting to see it now. People are getting nostalgic about Absolutely Fabulous and all that. So, and in 20 years' time, people will be getting nostalgic about Mrs. Brown's Boys. People are going to be getting nostalgic about, Frank Skinner and things like that. So I think people like looking back, and I think it's an indication of why we're in the sort of political state we're in, and with Brexit and everything. People like looking back to a comfy, safe past that has no uncertainty because it's happened, and they try and recreate that in a very uncertain world, and it doesn't work because there are no certainties, there is no safety. You've just got to do what you can to make now work. But you look back at old TV shows and you get people saying, oh yeah, well, you can't say that anymore, you can't do that, you couldn't do that now. You can do anything now, you can do all of it now. Whether you should is the question. So I think there's more freedom. People talk about free speech and being cancelled and all that. I think there's greater freedom now than there's ever been. You've just got to be able to supply a justification if you're asked for one. You can joke about anything. But if someone says, why did you tell that joke? You've got to be able to say, well, I did that joke because blah, 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 and not say, oh, you're a snowflake. Yeah.
Very true. I don't know about you, but I'm equally fascinated by the end of an entertainer's career as I am about their rise. How do you think Dawson's career would have continued had he not died so prematurely?
Now, see, the thing is, yeah, I'm fascinated by that as well. And you see a lot of comedians who rose plateaued and then fell. And quite often they were people who couldn't handle fame and didn't tackle it very well at all and annoyed a lot of people while they were famous. And then when they were starting to go on the slide, nobody was around to help them because they'd burnt up all their chances. Les universally loved. Les was going to have a career to his dying day, no matter what. I think the great sadness about Les is that he was just getting into straight acting. He did an astonishing thing. La Nonna, which was an Argentinian political play with Jane Horrocks and Jim Broadbent on television, where he played this Argentinian grandmother. And it's it's almost wordless. He's just making noises. But it is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And he would have done more of that. And also, I think if he'd survived another 10, 15 years, he'd have been on Have I Got News for You? He'd have done the whole Monkhouse thing. He'd have had to come back. They'd have all been crowding round him, the younger generation. His comedy was kind. There was nothing, very, very little racism in it. In fact, almost none. I've watched a lot of stuff, and because he's a Mancunian comedian of his generation, it's very tempting to sort of lump him in with Bernard Manning, and they couldn't have been further apart. And I think he'd have written books, he'd have done acting, he'd have done all sorts. I would have hoped he wouldn't do many more game shows. He was brilliant on Blankety Blank, but did you ever see Fast Friends, the one that came after it? Monkhouse could have made that work, but Les wasn't a game show technician. He was Les. And basically it was like directing traffic.
What channel was that on?
BBC One.
Oh.
About 1991.
Just never heard of that one.
I'll see if I can find you one. You will see what I mean.
Bob Monkhouse is someone who remains extremely significant within the story of British comedy for the way he pushed the art of television light entertainment and helped to shape it into what it was. What was his ultimate legacy?
Monkhouse's ultimate legacy, I don't think people realised how important he was until quite late on. And I don't think they realised how integral he was. Not just, you look at his comedy, but you don't realise how many people he took aside and nurtured. Now, and so much of the reason why all this Bob Monkhouse archive exists was because he'd record a show at home and keep the tape so that he'd have the tape. And if someone said, "Oh, we're thinking of booking that Victoria Wood," he'd go, "Oh, I've got her new faces. Right. Yeah, she's good. We'll get her." Yeah. So you'd keep this filing system. And it's the reason why Lenny Henry's first TV performance exists. And Sir Lenny at the BAFTA thing, when they showed the Monkhouse archive stuff, he said, "Well, Bob, we were the alternatives. Bob was, the chubby, but we were friends, and we'd see him at BAFTA or whatever, and he'd go, saw your show last night, thought it was brilliant. Second sketch needed a bit more, a bit less, and he'd give them notes, and they go, it's really annoying because he was always right, but he was an absolute, he was a student and a professor of comedy. He loved it. It was his life, and he was just tremendously kind. I just think he's a fascinating character. I think in a way he might be the most important British comedy figure of the 20th century. And I think if we're going to say what's his legacy, I'd say it's that BBC Two chat show he did where he interviewed comedians, just comedians. And it ran from 83 to about 87, and he had everyone on it. And there's one edition where he had Les Dawson and Jim Carrey together. before Jim Carrey was famous. He had the Americans over before anyone knew about them. Stephen Wright. He was a catalyst. He was a catalyst. Him, I think between him and Cryer, they touched every aspect of British comedy from the start of the 20th century to the end of it. Both very, very important men.
Similarly, if we're looking at the major icons of modern variety, we have to talk about Bruce Forsyth. It's a difficult question. Difficult question, but how would you sum up his contribution to the popularity of television entertainment and the phenomenon of the shared TV experience?
Well, the interesting thing about Bruce was he proved that without the right show, you could have all the personality in the world and still have a flop. Bruce's Big Night, when he went to LWT, they went, well, we've got Bruce, and they didn't know what to do with him. And they gave him this sprawling mess of a show. And Paul Smith, who directed a lot of them, and who went on to found Celador and run, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and all that. And Paul said, light entertainment shows, variety shows, you like to have it all blocked out and planned out. He said, directing Bruce's Big Night was like going back to directing news at Westwood with people putting stuff over your shoulders. Oh, this is coming next. This is coming next. You were directing it was like air traffic control rather than directing television. But on his day, in the right thing. Now, I think in a variety show, there was nobody better. Put Bruce. That was the thing. His catchphrase on Sunday night at the London Palladium, "I'm in charge." He came into television very fresh, very new, but he had instant authority. There was no nerves there, which was a curious thing. Incredibly talented guy, great pianist, and a dancer, singer, and he was funny. He had, again, gentle knocking. He, in Generation Game, the looks to the side with the camera. If someone was mucking up, throwing the pot or whatever, he'd look to one side and roll his eyes and get another laugh. So I think he was hugely important, but he needed the right vehicle. But again, back to Monkhouse, there was nobody. It was between him and Monkhouse for the best steering of a game show. They knew how to make it work. They knew what was going on. They knew how to orchestrate it. And I think a great game show host actually directs the show from the floor, and the director just points cameras at it. And you watch Generation Games and things like that. Bruce is moving people about in vision, getting them on their marks, getting them in their right spots. He knew how it worked. And I went to the memorial at the Palladium, the one that was televised, and the drummer on that in the orchestra, a guy called Neil Wilkinson. He owns a snare drum that used to belong to Kenny Clare, who was a great British session drummer who was in Alan Ainsworth's orchestra and all of them. And I'm friends with Neil. And after the show, I sent him a message. I said, "Were you using the snare?" He went, "Oh, yeah. And I said, "Wow." And he said, "Yeah, I knew that snare had been there before." And it was Shirley on the show as well. He went, "I knew that snare had been on that stage behind Shirley Bassey before. I hadn't." And he said, if that drum could talk, it was the whole history of light entertainment in one drum. And it was just majestic. It was lovely. And of course, after the show was over, the entire BBC Light Entertainment department and assorted hangers-on, including myself, went over the road and got pissed.
Knew you had to get one in about that. Josh was just saying that originally, before he was offered the Generation game show, Bill Cotton actually wanted Brucey to do a chat show format, but that inevitably went to Parky. So how different would have it all been if roles were reversed, per se?
Well, I've got to be honest. I think the right decision was made because Bruce was good with Bruce was good on the Generation game, getting stuff out of the punters who came on. But I can't imagine him. Actually, if you've ever seen Bruce as a guest on Parky, you can get a flavour of what it was like because he's never off. He doesn't shut up. He doesn't sit and listen. And I think that's a big part of what you need for a chat show host. And I think the best Parky shows were the ones where Parky shut up and let the guests interview themselves.
Yeah. 2022 has already been a devastating year for comedy. The great Barry Cryer was a great friend of Beyond the Title, and I was fortunate enough to be the recipient of legendary phone calls on many occasions from him. But what is his legacy to British comedy?
Oh, what's Barry Cryer's legacy to British comedy? It's all the lives that he touched, and he touched every life. You know, all of the people who work in comedy have a Barry Cryer story, even if they only met him once. And every story will be what a nice, helpful, kind, funny bloke he was. And it was just, that's his legacy. And I think he sort of viewed himself as, a line man, and not, he was, again, he was like Monkhouse, always a fan, always a student of it, never not learning. And I'd be standing at the bar with him in Simpsons in the Strand, and at an oldie lunch or oldie of the year or whatever, and we'd be there with our pints, and he'd look across, and Ray Gorton and Alan Simpson would be on the other side of the room. And I went, "Oh, it's Ray and Alan." He went, yeah. I still can't believe that they're my friends. I went, "What?" He went, "They're my heroes, and we're friends." And I just went, "Well, I feel the same way about you." So it was, it's just, it was. He was never. He never stopped being a fan. He never stopped being curious. He never stopped. You will speak to so many younger comedians, and he loved being around younger comedians. He loved exchanging, and the jokes that he would tell when in younger comedians' company would be absolutely up to the minute, and they loved him. There's that lovely story about him giving Stuart Lee the skunk eye at Edinburgh, and Stuart walking up to him and saying, "Is there something wrong? Are you upset with me?" And Barry said, "Well, I'm very upset that you stole my gaping anus of Christ routine." And which is just a beautiful joke. And it was just, but the fact that he'd set up, he spent about 15 minutes of ignoring Stuart to set it up. It was, in terms of a tangible legacy, the Everett Thames shows. Definitely pure. I think every writer has a performer that they are. You can be a great writer, but unless the performer's right, it doesn't work necessarily right. So Eddie Braben was lucky. He had, the performers who worked with Eddie Braben were lucky, but he had two great collaborations. Eric and Ernie we know about, but before then, he was the head writer for Ken Dodd. And it was like, in both cases, it was 2 and then 3 minds thinking the same thought. He got into their minds and wrote the stuff that they would have written if they'd been the sort of people who sat down and wrote stuff down. With Cryer, he was born to work with Everett, and the way they worked and the way they riffed off each other, and the BBC shows are great and I love them, but it's the Thames ones where they're basically doing radio on television, and Ray Cameron and Barry would write a gag, they'd get it up on autocue, Kenny would do it once, the crew would laugh, and then they'd move on. There was no attempt to do the show as a structure. It was just do the gags, and let David Mallet knit it all together. And it was rip and read. And it was, but the fact that he could, the fact that Cryer could do that Everett stuff and work with Arthur Askey, Arthur Askey, who'd been, in Bandwagon in the war, it just that breadth, just that spread of comedy, and he did it all equally brilliantly.
In an interview from 2003, Bill Cotton said of Eric Morecambe, "Every so often, someone stands on top of Everest." What do you think he meant by this?
I think Bill meant that some people are just untouchable and they reach summits that others would, can't reach with, I mean, Everest is littered with bodies of people attempting to climb it. I mean, they're basically used as direction markers now. Oh yeah, no. The orange anorak, turn left at the brown cagoule, and it's a great pub, that. And I think Variety and Light Entertainment are littered with bodies, of people who died on stage. And actually, Morecambe and Wise died on stage plenty of times. They never, when they were younger, they walked off to the sound of their own footsteps, particularly in Glasgow. But I think, see, the thing is, I wonder if Bill wasn't slightly building his own part up subtly there, because I think Eric stood on the summit of Everest on the shoulders of Eddie Braben and Bill Cotton and John Ammons. I think, as great as Eric and Ernie were, they needed that atmosphere at the BBC. That they were great comedians before that, and they had a lot of success on ITV. But when they went to the BBC in '68, and then Sid and Dick went back to ATV, and then Eddie Braben came in, it all clicked into place, and suddenly the sky was the limit. But I do think there are a lot of them up there on Everest, and also I think the air is incredibly thin up there, and I think you need to have a certain, you need to have the right equipment to survive it. I think you need the perspective, and a lot of people don't. They can't. They get to Everest, and suddenly it's like, so to get to Everest and stay there, that's very few have done that, and I tend to write about the ones who did. But I would love to write about the ones who didn't. I've got this fascination with speciality acts and novelty turns and jugglers and trampoline artists. Like, there's a guy called Ronaldo the Rebounder, can perform act in height of 8 feet. So that's all he needed. He just needed an 8-foot ceiling, and he was golden. Ventriloquists and Bob the Tray Blackman, the guy who used to sing Mule Train while hitting himself, Mule Train rather, while hitting himself on the head with a tin tray. That's an act, isn't it? Where you going? You'd pay to go and see that.
Do you ever think of an alternative universe where some of the decisions at BBC management didn't happen? For example,
One, two, so yeah, I think it was Maria, he was right, but got sound no, what have the would like a would be is that Jim would been 10 million yeah.
right, I'll try and remember that. What if when Brucey left Generation Game and then Jimmy Tarbuck came along and was offered it instead, basically?
Yeah. But Jim,
I think it would have been a very different show to the one Larry Grayson presented. But I don't know. I don't know if you can do this sliding doors stuff with it. I think there are all sorts of things that could have happened, and that, there are what ifs about, oh, why didn't they do so and so? But at the same time, there are things. Well, thank God they didn't do so and so. I see. I'm very prosaic. I like to deal in the tangible and the known, rather than theorize wildly about what could have happened and what should have happened. I have some small what ifs, but nothing that would have really changed the course of everything. Would Les Dawson been better off with Billy Marsh as an agent? That's about my level.
So, looking back at your own career, what's your proudest achievement?
My proudest achievement in my own career. Okay, no names, no pack drill, but a very, very senior figure in light entertainment. Apparently, when people contact him for an interview, he says, "Have you read Turned Out Nice Again? If it's not in there, please come back to me, but it's probably in there."
Can Josh give a few guesses who that might be?
Privately.
Privately, yeah, fair enough. Off the record, yeah. And finally, what's next for Louis Barfe?
Well, I've got big band practice in Pontypridd tonight, so I've got a load of drum kit into the car.
And beyond that?
I've got big band practice in Bristol tomorrow, so I'll probably leave the drums in the car.
That's smart, very smart.
I'm always working on all sorts of things, but I don't ever want to talk about them until I know I'm going well with them.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure, mate. My pleasure. Lovely to see you again, Josh, and lovely to meet you, Ian.